Hello, I'm Anthony. One of the difficulties we face when we're writing music outside the wheelhouse of our technical ability is how to make those performances sound as natural as possible. Today we're going to be having a look at a piece of music that I released last week. I'll put a link in the description below to this piece. It's called Good Night, and it's a very relaxing, very slow piece of music using bowed string instruments, in particular cello, viola and violin. I can't play any bowed instruments, and so it's very difficult for me to make this stuff sound natural. So by way of introduction, I'm going to play you a short 8-bar section from this piece of music. We're going to use the viola and the violin in conjunction. Those two instruments are going to show us all of the stuff that I want to talk about today. But before we actually dive in, here's the 8 bars that we're going to be examining today. Now, by necessity, we're going to need to look at this from a couple of different perspectives today. Firstly, we're going to have a look at the notes themselves, and I'll describe the articulations and bowing methods used to produce that really kind of relaxed, emotional performance. The second is an actual examination of the plugins themselves. I'm using plugins from the Contact sample library. So we have the Amati viola and the Guarneri violin. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is obviously going to involve the specific implementation of these instruments. If you use a different sample library, obviously there's going to be some small differences. I can't really account for those. All I can do is talk about it from this perspective. But anyway, without further ado, let's dive in. I'm going to mute the cello and the violin so we can just concentrate on the viola. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the distinction between a couple of the articulations, in particular sustained and détaché. Now, hopefully you understand what the word sustain means. In the context of a bowed instrument, however, it's really basically linking the notes together. They all sound as if they're flowing one after the other. On the other hand, détaché notes are played distinctly. Now, there's no actual gap in between the notes, but they are all played so that they're clearly articulated. Now let's translate that into the world of the plugins. All of these small notes in the lower register are articulation events. They're not producing sound, they're changing the way the instrument is going to be played. And the two that we're concentrating on for this first example are the G's and the B's, because G puts us in détaché mode and B puts us in sustain mode. Now the word bowed is tagged on to these articulations. That simply means that every single note is played individually. Both of these are bowed examples, so we don't need to worry about that just for now. We'll have a look at a different kind of bowing technique in a moment. The advantage of using détaché is that it allows us to play slightly quicker notes. If we're going to play very quick notes, that's a different thing. We'll worry about that again later. But this is for quite clear, distinct individual notes, as opposed to sustain, which has greater difficulty playing those distinct notes. There's more of a lead in because the notes are supposed to merge together. So let's go back to the MIDI notes and see how I've implemented this. Every time there's a reasonably short note, this E is an example of one, I switch to détaché mode to make that note sound clearly. As soon as that's done, however, my default position is to switch back to sustain because that's the one that gives me the more elongated kind of feeling. You can basically hold a sustain note for as long as you want. When you play the détaché note, however, it has a shorter duration. So you can see me constantly changing between these two different articulations. I'm going to pull a phrase back right to the beginning of the 8-bar section that we're sampling, and you can see me toggling between these two. I'll stop before we get to anything different. Did you hear how that single note was clearly articulated? If I mute that détaché articulation and I play the same phrase, did you hear how those two notes, they just don't work as well together? They don't fit together properly because they're trying to blur in a space of time that there just isn't enough room for those sustain notes to merge together. Now, on the other hand, if I take the sustain articulation away and we try to play that entire phrase détaché, it's going to be a bit of a train wreck. It just doesn't have the length, it doesn't have the length of the sustain note to actually hold it for that long. So anytime I'm playing a reasonably long note, I want to be in sustain mode. For the shorter passages, anything like these notes up here, I make sure I'm in détaché mode. And both of them are bowed, which means every single one of those notes is played individually with a bow stroke. So what does it sound like if we don't change the bow direction for every note? Well, in that case, we've switched to fingered mode rather than bowed. Let's have a look at the violin for an example of this. Sustain finger is on articulation A. Here it is. So now we've introduced a new letter, and what this gives us is basically the bow is traveling in one direction, but we play multiple notes, and it makes it sound very slightly smoother. This is a subtle thing, but these are the things that actually matter. This is what helps you emulate a natural performance, make it basically cheat as well as you possibly can. So now we've switched to listening to the violin instead. The transition between this D and E note, they're going to be played on the same string, and I'll actually bring up the virtual instrument so that you can see the position of the fingerboard where these notes are being played. If I don't have that sustained finger articulation, in fact, let's move it up to a sustained bowed instead. It just sounds very slightly more laboured because we're having to switch bow direction between those two notes. Takes that fraction of a second longer to get there, and therefore doesn't sound as good. We want it to sound as natural and fluent as possible. Did you also see on the fingerboard between those two notes, I'm actually playing on the same string. This is pretty important. Those two notes there were both on the same fingerboard. They were tiny little white dots. I appreciate it's difficult to see this stuff. There's no point putting a finger articulation in if you're playing different strings because, you know, one finger can't do that job. So you need to pay attention to what the plugin is actually doing. Now, it is possible to override the finger positioning of notes by preferencing high strings, smart or low strings. Generally speaking, I leave the instrument to it because whoever's programmed this knows bowed instruments better than me. But generally speaking, wherever I've got the opportunity to use a finger articulation, because I can see visually that the notes are being played on the same string, more often than not, I'm going to try to take advantage of that because it does make it sound more natural. Now let's talk about some of those fringe cases where we want to add a little bit more fruit to the solo. And the first one is portamento. The best example of portamento in this 8-bar section is the B3, from D down to B3 at the end of bar 47. Here you can see the articulation being activated just before we get to the note. We will talk about note positions a little bit later. I just want to run through the primary articulations first. So have a listen to the transition from the D to the B. Here we go. There's another one at the end there from the A to the G. There's less distance to travel between those two notes. The portamento still sounds nice and it's still worth adding in, but of course you've only got a 2 semitone slide, so it's going to sound less dramatic. There are 2 other key switches employed in this solo. The next one is a run. Let's have a look at these group of notes up here. These are played quite quickly, in fact too quickly for détaché to play properly. If you imagine you're bowing as quickly as you possibly can, then this is going to start sounding unnatural because you simply can't play them all fast enough. And so for this instance, we use the key switch on E, which is in this case sustain run. So these are specifically for playing notes quickly. We'll just have a listen to those 4 notes again to demonstrate, and then I'll switch to some different articulations. Now I'll mute the sustain run so we basically stay in sustained mode. This is going to sound pretty bad. Sustain simply cannot keep up with that speed. Let's try it in détaché mode though. This isn't going to sound as bad. Détaché can kind of pull it off. But really not as clearly enunciated as the dedicated runs articulation. That's the only way that you ever really get to hear that intermediate D. It's just too quick to be heard by any other method. One final articulation I want to examine before we have a look at the positioning of the MIDI notes, and this is marcato. Marcato is where you basically strike more forcefully down on the string. The English translation of this word is marked, and you're basically striking or marking the note clearly. Okay, so what we're going to use marcato for is to help to enunciate two different notes that are very close together. Now, I've discovered by practicing with the various different key switches on these contact plugins that it was actually very difficult to get these two notes to really clearly articulate, and the best way to do it was with marcato notes. So we're back to listening to the viola now. Listen out for these second of the note pairs on the G and the F. Now, there are two different ways to accomplish marcato. To demonstrate this, I've brought in the automation lane because the automation is tied to the dynamics, the range of dynamics. And you see this big scoop on my modulation wheel here. That's basically pulling the drama of this marcato way down. So have a listen to the difference between these two different played notes. The second of the note pairs are both played marcato. The first has more punch to it and the second one is more laid back. Hear that first one really kind of, it doesn't kick you in the face, but it's certainly got more drama to it. Let's solo it. Whereas the second one is much more laid back. In fact, when you listen to it very closely in solo, there's still a little bit of a volume bump. This was the best I could do to kind of pull it back, and in the mix it completely disappears and sounds totally fine. So at this point, that's all the different effects I've used for this particular solo. As far as articulations are concerned, we've got sustain, marcato and détaché, and then we've got multiple different ways of playing those strings. Bowed plays each note individually, bow, 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 bow. Finger plays one single bow stroke while multiple notes are being played underneath. Portamento glides from one note to the next, and runs is specifically designed to play quick notes, where the performance that's being input with the sample player has been distinctly articulated to make each note sound as clearly as possible. The final thing I'll mention very quickly today is the MIDI positioning of the notes, because they're all going to have very slightly different attack lengths. If when I played this thing in, I played it under a single articulation, I just had sustain bowed, I think, was my input method of choice, which meant when I come to use different articulations with their different attack lengths, you're going to need to adjust the notes accordingly. One illustration of this was the portamento effect. Generally speaking, I found that wherever I wanted to employ portamento, you can see me bringing in the articulation just before the note actually sounds. The portamento on this particular instrument was happiest when the two notes were overlapped, so you need to basically have some connection between these two notes, but the second note is played much closer to the beat than any other, so I was having to move the portamento notes pretty much onto or very close to the beat to make them sound as natural as possible. Oh, there's an even better example actually here. The B3 is really close to the beat. Let's have a listen to that. You can hear it's got a very long portamento. The note takes ages to get in, but actually we begin the portamento articulation on the beat itself. If these two notes don't overlap, then you won't get the portamento. So just make sure that they're actually adjoining or overlapping, and the effect will work fine. But if you bring this note too far forwards, it's going to kick off too soon. See, that felt kind of anxious to me, just a little bit too previous. So generally speaking, I was bringing the portamento a bit closer to the beat. This is just a suck it and see thing, Because if, like me, you've input it using one articulation, when you switch to the others, don't presume all of the notes can stay in the same place. They can't. You've got to listen to the whole thing and see how it breathes and potentially adjust every note manually. It's going to be worth the effort. I was really pleased with the end product, that these three bowed instruments all working together. I think it does sound really natural. I've tried very hard to put myself in the position of a musician that I am not. You know, I can't do this thing naturally, so I have to resort to using all of these technical tricks to make it sound as naturally as possible. But that's not to say you can't actually sit there and close your eyes and imagine that you're playing the cello or the viola. How are you actually going to accomplish that? Patrons and channel members at the project manager level have access to this Cubase project. You can download it and play with this stuff yourself. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.